Okay, let's make a start. Welcome everybody to today's talk. Today's event is jointly organized by the Center for Comparative and Public Law and the Faculty of Law, and also for the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures, the CSGC. This is the second collaboration between the faculty and the CSGC. The first one was earlier this semester, and we had a really interesting talk by Gary Simpson of the London School of Economics on his new book, The Sentimental Life of International Law. And I hope that there will be many more interdisciplinary collaborations between us to come. So before I introduce Dr. Tucker, I will hand things over to Dr. Alvin Wong, the director of CSGC, just to say a few words.
And I again also like to express thanks to Professor Michael Wan. And as Michael mentioned already, we have collaborated in the past, and CSGC at Conflict, it stands for Center for the Study of Globalization and Culture, and it's a research platform at the Department of Comparative Literature in the Faculty of Arts, which interrogates and issues of race and gender, colonialism, post-colonialism, globalization, and transnational sexualities. We actually have a research cluster on global sexuality, and that hosts events on history of homosexuality in Germany, queer Sinophone culture, and so on and so forth. So I'm very pleased that we are again collaborating with the School of Law and the Center for Comparative and Public Law, and particularly excited about Professor Andrew Tucker's talk. So now I'll pass things back to Professor Wang to introduce Andrew.
Okay, it's all seeming a little bit it's all seeming very, very formal. Okay, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Tucker, who's come to us all the way from South Africa. Dr. Tucker is an associate professor at the University of Cape Town, where he is also deputy director of the African Center for Cities. He has worked on a number of HIV programs across the global south, and his talk today will critically engage with the use of international human rights discourses to support sexuality-based justice in Africa. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much, Marco and Alvin, for that great introduction and very warm welcome. And it's wonderful to be here. I arrived from South Africa under 2 days ago, so my jet lag is in full force. So if this talk appears slightly postmodern, I apologize in advance. The first thing to say, though, really, as a caveat to what I'm going to be talking about today, is that although I'm talking about human rights discourses primarily in human rights law, I'm not a legal scholar and I'm not a lawyer. But I am intrigued at understanding the different strategies to attempt to effect ultimately legal change to support sexuality-based justice for especially non-heteronormative communities across Africa, a region of the world that I think many people know has a severe lack of legal protections and very significant sexuality-based discrimination. So I have given a version of this talk before to geographers, and when I did it then, they kind of glossed over all the legal aspects and focused on other things. So for the legal scholars in the room, it would be interesting perhaps in the Q&A to discuss some more of the legal aspects, because I was kind of self-taught when trying to understand the mechanics as to how human rights law actually functions. Okay, so in this talk, I really want to do three things. The first is to critically engage with human rights discourses as they relate to human rights across Africa. As I'll discuss in this talk, the articulation in a Gramscian sense between human rights and gay rights has ideologically been an attempt to make common sense the link between those two processes. So human rights are viewed as gay rights and gay rights are viewed as human rights. And this is seen to be a particularly productive way of trying to address sexuality-based injustices across Africa. While that may well be the case, it has been over 10 years since that articulation or that discursive link was first made. And I would argue it's not necessarily been as successful as some people might like or suggest it has been. And so the first part of this talk is really going to be exploring why that might be. What might be the reasons why the articulation between gay rights and human rights may sometimes struggle, and equally what sometimes may be the unintended consequences of that particular articulation, which I would suggest also in some ways lead into reasons why the articulation itself struggles. And I'm going to do this by looking at three different schematic foci. The first is issues of legitimacy, then issues of spatial inequality, and then issues of socio-spatial relationships. I should stress here, though, that in this talk, I'm in no way negating the power of the link between human rights and gay rights. I think that there is utility in it, but I would also suggest that there are certain potential pitfalls if we rely solely on that articulation to address sexuality-based justice in an African context. And so because of that, in the second part of this talk, what I want to do is think about other internationally derived processes to support sexuality-based justice in Africa, namely work around the HIV/AIDS pandemic and more recent work on economic development, and think through how they may complement work on the articulation between human rights and gay rights. And I'll do that by thinking about the HIV/AIDS pandemic and work that's been done to address that, and work recently on economic development, also in the context of legitimacy, spatial inequality, and social-spatial relationships. To conclude, what I'd also like to do is then think about what future research on sexuality-based justice in Africa may mean. And I want to make the proposal that the key scale at which that type of work needs to be done is at the urban scale. Because a lot of these processes that we're talking about, human rights, HIV/AIDS programmatic work, and economic development, are derived by international organizations, international policy processes. And the question really is, how do they land on the African continent? And I think that the key focal area for future research needs to be urban Africa. Okay, so to move on. Just to explain quickly why I'm focusing on Africa. I mean, partly it's because I live there, but it's also because if you look at this map, the countries in red are the ones with laws that directly discriminate against non-heteronormative communities. You can see that predominantly those countries are in Africa. I do, as a geographer, also obviously feel the need to critique maps like this. I think that they are in some ways potentially neo-colonial. For example, the reasons why there is discrimination in African contexts is actually largely because of colonial law. It's because of the British laws, because of French laws that have stayed on the statute books since the time of colonialism. I think it's also somewhat problematic to shade the United States in blue, especially in recent years with the rise of certain populist movements, and the same, I think, for the UK. So I take with a pinch of salt maps like this, but it's generally just to show the reason why I'm focusing on Africa. And the other critique for this map as well, which I'll talk about a bit in this talk, is that right at the bottom of Africa is the country that I now live in, South Africa, which is a deep shade of blue, which would seem to imply that it has particular sexuality-based rights protections, which it does in its constitution. But I think that that hides gross economic inequalities and gross inequalities in terms of actually being able to enact and be protected by particular rights. And that's something I'll talk about more in this talk. Okay, but first of all, as I'm sure many people in this room are aware, the situation across various African states is that there exists widespread homophobic rhetoric by political leaders, widespread examples of sexuality-based injustice, including various forms of violence, including rape and murder of non-heteronormative groups. And I don't know if you can see it on the slide there, but the picture on the top left is just from last month. It's an article from Reuters talking about how Uganda now has an anti-gay bill that is the most draconian on the continent, which really is saying something. Next to that, there's an article from the London Independent talking about Ghanaian activists describing the need for decriminalization of homosexuality because of a significant spike in anti-LGBT violence. And on the right there, you have an example from Nigeria, which just came out a few days ago, talking about the robbing and torture of queer individuals. So you see a situation generally on the continent where at various scales, both in terms of political leadership, in terms of legal processes, and in terms of societal responses, you have severe discrimination and persecution of non-heteronormative communities. And just at the bottom here are some publicly available images just describing some of the protests that go on in African cities with regard to homophobic rhetoric. So what's done about this? Well, the way in which, the primary way in which this type of situation is being addressed is through an articulation between human rights and gay rights. And this is an articulation that's been around for a very long time. It actually goes back to, say, the 1960s and 1970s in the global north, particularly in cities in the United States. But it really crystallized and gained tremendous momentum in 2011, when the then Secretary of State to the US, Hillary Clinton, made a speech at the United Nations in Geneva on Human Rights Day. And this is the line from the speech that went global. Like being a woman, like being a racial, religious, tribal, or ethnic minority, being LGBT does not make you less human. And that is why gay rights are human rights, and why human rights are gay rights. And so this is that articulation. This is that discursive link. And it's being made by one of the most senior diplomatic leaders in the global north. And it's a line that has been subsequently taken up across various African states by various NGOs. The top left here is literally the statement from Clinton's speech on a placard by a political party in South Africa. In the bottom left here, you see again the quote directly being used in a political march. You can buy T-shirts and other stash, literally with the slogan written on it. And you see variants of the slogan being used generally across the continent. So this articulation between human rights and gay rights is seen to be particularly important. The question is why? Well, we know that human rights are meant to be universal. Every human has them. We also know that all humans are meant to be equal. And we also know that human rights are meant to be inalienable. So generally, the idea of human rights can be seen to position every human, no matter where they are, as requiring a similar type of legal protection. And an appeal to human rights is especially important in the attainment of gay rights across sub-Saharan Africa because of their potential to sidestep certain arguments that exist on the continent, which suggest that homosexuality is un-African. And these arguments really focus on the idea that, in a particular reading of African culture, there was no same-sex desire prior to the arrival of colonial powers into the continent. And more recently, the rise of, say, gay rights political movements in Africa are seen to be funded by outside forces which are not endogenous, which are not local to Africa. So these culturally relativist arguments basically collectively suggest that any recourse to human rights are an external imposition on the neo-colonial nation. And so a recourse to human rights is an attempt to sidestep that argument and say, well, irrespective of whether gay rights and same-sex communities existed in Africa prior to colonialism, the point is all humans should be seen as equal. All humans should therefore be granted the same type of rights. And because of that, an appeal to human rights can allow, hopefully, for the implementation of lower rights or state rights within particular countries to be implemented. Because of this, same-sex communities can therefore be framed as not associated with outside forces that threaten the sanctity of the post-colonial nation, and instead can highlight the shared connections and needs of all individuals, no matter their sexual desires. So that's the power, that's the utility, that's the strength of attempting to articulate a link between human rights and gay rights. And it's also something, it's a particular playbook that has been used internationally and also across the continent. internationally, the frame gay rights are human rights are gay rights, has been used by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, and obviously by the US State Department. And also just in the context of various African states, you see the exact same playbook being used by a range of NGOs in the continent, all attempting to make this articulation between gay rights and human rights, to sidestep these culturally relativist arguments, these homophobic arguments, which suggest that any recourse to discussing gay rights is an external threat, is something that is un-African. But my question isn't so much why these organizations are now working to use this model, which I think is pretty well thought out, but rather why it might struggle and what might its unintended consequences be. So to do that, I want to look at, as I mentioned earlier, these three potential ways in to understand the risks and the potential unintended consequences of deploying this articulation between human rights and gay rights. And these are legitimacy, spatial inequality, and socio-spatial relationships. So the first one, and for the legal scholars in the room, this obviously isn't rocket science, but it's kind of important to understand in the context of how these critiques land in an African context, is that there's no universally accepted understanding as to what exactly makes the universality of human rights legitimate. There are different strategies. There's the natural law approach, which says that in any given society, there's a series of general moral standards that can form the basis for human rights. Yet we also know that significant variation regarding the rights and protections to be granted to LGBT groups across different states suggests that any recourse to universalism may be misguided, as no culture or society by nature is either supportive or incompatible with human rights. Equally, the positive law approach, which rejects natural law arguments which presuppose an a priori claim to a source of rights, also struggles with legitimacy challenges. International human rights law here is but the reflection of different state laws, which when taken together can provide a basis for human rights claims. Yet here too, difficulties can emerge because laws can exist which are clearly not moral and therefore do not support a human rights approach. So from this perspective, then, the issue of legitimacy remains. So as I say, there therefore remains significant difficulty in finding a universally accepted view as to what can enable the alleged very universality of human rights. And there therefore equally exists difficulty in finding legitimacy in saying that gay rights actually form a component of human rights. Now, for lawyers and legal scholars, as I say, this isn't rocket science, but it creates very particular issues when an international approach, such as that around universal human rights, actually lands in various African states. And a reason for this is that a key reason why human rights may have power in confronting those opposed to gay rights is their supposed ability to reframe debates, to sidestep issues of cultural relativism, to sidestep arguments around homosexuality being an African. They're meant to enable a sidestepping of relativist claims as to who historically has or has not been part of the nation, by calling instead on wider international and indeed universal claims. But such a strategy suffers when the universal nature of human rights is called into question. As Amartya Sen has argued, human rights remain intellectually frail and lacking foundation. And then what is and what is not a human right is therefore open to debate, and perhaps just as importantly, politically and geopolitically malleable. And nowhere is this clearer than in Uganda, the country which now has the most draconian laws. And this is just a photo from the front page of the leading national newspaper in Uganda called the Rolling Stone, where they feel totally legitimate in having as their front page story the outing of 100 homosexuals, identifying their names, where they live, what their occupations are. The question is, why would Uganda do this? And how could they get away with this in the context of human rights logics? Well, Uganda, for those that don't know the country, Uganda for a very long time had a very authoritarian regime, a dictatorial regime under Idi Amin. When that came to an end, there was a dramatic shift in the political and legal system within the country, and human rights became a key framing device for Uganda after the fall of Idi Amin. So that's from the 1980s into the 1990s. But what's happened in Uganda is that because of, you could argue, this intellectual fragile nature of human rights, it's not human rights and gay rights that become articulated together. It's human rights and the rights of the heterosexual family that become articulated together. So in the context of Uganda, the traction of saying human rights and gay rights are articulated together has no traction whatsoever, because the articulation between human rights and the rights of the heterosexual family trump it. And so because of that, the argument that Hillary Clinton would like to put forward totally fails, and Uganda can simultaneously be for human rights and directly opposed to gay rights. And that's why you can end up with a country that prides itself on its human rights history, having newspaper articles such as that. So that's the first point, legitimacy. The second part of a schema that I want to consider here is the issue of spatial inequality. So as Kate Nash, for example, has pointed out, there's a continued risk that human rights can be applied unevenly within states, despite their supposed universalism. And a good example of this is the same-sex marriage campaign in South Africa, which took place in 2006. Now, South Africa obviously is unique on the African continent in terms of having enshrined sexuality-based protections within its Bill of Rights, within its constitution, at the beginning of the post-apartheid era. And the campaign for same-sex marriage successfully articulated a strong connection to human rights to put forward its arguments, with both scholars and activists pointing out a direct link between the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights, the 1955 South African Freedom Charter put forward by the ANC and its allies, and the discursive logics of the same-sex marriage campaign. And indeed, South Africa's National Coalition for Equality that drove this really was amazingly successful. In the period of 11 years, South Africa went from criminalizing, locking up, and in some cases, forcing sex changes on men with same-sex desire to allowing men with same-sex desire to marry. I mean, no country in the world has so radically shifted its focus so quickly. And you could argue that that was largely because of its success by drawing on this human rights framework. But at the same time, the legislative successes of the same-sex marriage campaign must also be read against an inability to effectively engage with wider spatial inequalities that inhibit the ability of couples to marry. And in particular, spatial variability of social discrimination and violence can hinder the ability of same-sex couples to marry even today, even if legal sanction exists. And this is especially prevalent in former apartheid designated areas of South Africa, such as the former townships, which suffer from wide-scale economic marginalization and also severe homophobia. And you can just see from the types of pictures, if you Google same-sex marriage South Africa, the pictures that come up are white middle-class individuals who have the legal protection to actually be able to benefit from the law. They have the police, they have the ability to be protected and be supported by the legal change that's happened. That isn't the case for other groups within the country. And this gets even more problematic if you look in detail at some of the particular mechanisms and discourses that were put forward by the same-sex marriage campaign in South Africa. For example, Natalie Oswin, the queer geographer, has described the way in which the same-sex marriage campaign actually tried to play lip service to spatial inequality by making the case that marriage would help lift out of poverty Black gay couples in townships. Now that you have to kind of think through how would that work. Well, the logic was that if you allow same-sex couples to marry, then they are supposedly protected by the law, and particularly say one member of the couple dies, then the other person can benefit through inheritance rights and certain legal protections that wouldn't exist if they weren't married. But at the same time, you can make the case, well, heterosexuals have been able to marry in township spaces for 60, 70 years, and marriage hasn't exactly lifted those individuals out of poverty. So as the South African legal scholar Pierre de Vos has argued, the same-sex marriage campaigns focus on legal change legitimated and enabled through a human rights framework meant that it was not able to successfully address wider spatial economic inequalities, despite being aware of them and also at times even deploying them in their discursive arguments. And all of this means is that in reality, the people that benefit from this human rights articulation with gay rights in the context of South Africa are the white middle classes. And while most work has been done in South Africa on this, understandably because of the constitution, if you look at Gini coefficients across post-colonial states on the continent, you see very wide-ranging differences in terms of the middle classes and the poor. So although it's most obvious, I think, because of the race and class link in South Africa, I think that similar manifestations could quite easily happen in other countries on the continent. So the third area of the schema is the issue of socio-spatial relationships. And this is where things get a bit more complicated. The first thing to say about this is that anthropologists for a very long time have known that there are large numbers of men with same-sex desire in African contexts who are engaging in sex with other men, but would identify to the wider community as heterosexual. And recently, in the past few years, epidemiological data has backed this up with hardcore quantitative stats, and has really shown the sheer scale of this. Just as one example, a study was recently done in Malawi, Namibia, and Botswana, which showed that only about 50% of men who have sex with men identify with non-heterosexual identity labels. In other words, only 50% of men who are having sex with other men would identify with a label such as gay, which means that 50% of men who are having sex with other men identify as heterosexual. Now, in the context of human rights claims, to be able to exert a human right, you need to actually have an active exercise to claim a right, to say, I am being denied something because of, for example, my sexual identity, therefore I require something which is currently not being provided by the state. That creates significant problems in the context of certain African states, because who is actually pushing for these rights? If only half the number of people who are men who have sex with men are identifying as gay, then you have, or the local term for non-heteronormative, then you have a limited number of people who are actually able to exert that right. So that's one challenge. Linked to that, though, is the challenge that exists around particularly socio-spatial relationships. Existing evidence from across countries, such as Senegal, Namibia, the DRC, and South Africa, has highlighted how particular spaces enable and are the result of clandestine and semi-clandestine sexual relationships between men who identify as heterosexual and those who do not. Such spaces, in many instances, are semi-private and precarious, and the types of sexual interaction that are possible within them may be equally so. And something else that the data is showing is that large numbers of men who identify as gay or with a non-heteronormative identity label are having sexual relationships with men who identify as heterosexual. So what's important to appreciate about the spaces in which these types of social sexual interaction are taking place is that they allow for types of homosocial interaction that would otherwise be impossible. Now, if we think back to the whole issue of what does this mean for human rights, well, we find a situation where, on the one hand, if you push for human rights and you attempt to get everyone to align with, you could argue, a Western-centric notion of this exertion of a right, these types of spaces are going to disappear. And you'd have to argue, well, is that appropriate? Is that actually just a form of neocolonialism? If we accept that there are certain socio-sexual configurations going on in certain African cities, which are very different to the Western-centric approach of saying that you get, say, spatial agglomeration of gay individuals, you get gay territories, gay bars, you get economic enterprise, and out of that you get political representation and a call for rights. If we assume that that is actually a parochial model, that is something that only exists in global North context, and if we accept the legitimacy of these clandestine spaces, some of which are shown here, then we have to question quite how human rights and human rights approaches are going to align with that, when identities don't necessarily align with behaviors, where the types of sexual interactions that are occurring don't align with global North approaches, and where the types of spaces where these things are occurring don't also align with global North approaches. And this is just from some of my travels, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but these are the types of spaces, one from Kenya and one from South Africa, of these semi-clandestine and clandestine spaces that exist across the continent. So that's the schema. It's not to say, as I mentioned earlier, that we should entirely do away with human rights-based approaches as articulated with gay rights, because clearly there is utility. You know, even in somewhere like South Africa, where there were challenges in terms of spatial inequality, we know to a certain extent that they can, to a certain degree, that they can be successful. But we should also be aware of the weaknesses that can happen with these approaches, of this approach. So if we take a broader view of sexuality-based justice that includes but also extends beyond legal change associated with human rights and gay rights, we may see a range of other internationally derived discourses and policy processes designed to support the needs of non-heteronormative communities in Africa. These can then be evaluated against this schema to see where human rights may be supported by other approaches and where potentially other things may be needed. So the first of these other internationally derived approaches is HIV work on the continent of Africa. Now, as many people know, Africa suffers a particularly severe HIV pandemic. South Africa has the highest HIV prevalence in the world. What is perhaps less well known is the amount of money that goes towards addressing the HIV needs of certain LGBT populations across Africa and across the global South. Just as one stat to indicate this. In the top left here is a report that was recently done in 2020 that looked at a total of 800 grant-making organizations, including philanthropic organizations that included private and public foundations, corporate funders, multilateral agencies, and nation states between the years 2017 and 2018. So over 2 years, these are the years where the most recent data is available. They basically looked at where money was being spent on LGBT rights-based issues across Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Asia, and Central Asia. So basically, all the money that was going to focus on human rights, gay rights arguments across the global South. The figure is, depending how you count, goes up or goes down slightly, but roughly you're talking about $174 million over 2 years. By way of comparison, in just 2019 alone, the US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which is the logo in the top middle there, allocated $360 million to what are termed key populations, which is primarily men who have sex with men and trans women. So double that which is being used to address the human rights, gay rights argument. And yet this doesn't get the same international recognition. It doesn't get the articles in international newspapers, but double the amount of money is being spent to address the HIV pandemic among certain LGBT populations to that which is used to support human rights, gay rights arguments across the global South. So what does this mean? Well, in terms of legitimacy, you see a different logic being used here to support these communities. The legitimacy here is a pragmatic need to reduce HIV incidence and prevalence across all communities, across heterosexual communities and among MSM and trans groups. So here, you don't get a bifurcation between gay groups being seen as outside of the nation, whereas heterosexual groups being seen as part of the nation that need protecting. You see a general collective understanding that all these groups need to be addressed if you're going to reduce HIV prevalence within particular states. You also find a direct focus here on addressing sexuality-based injustices, and that functions at two scales. There's now a general understanding at a state level that unless you address homophobia, you're not going to address HIV. And the reason for that is if you have homophobia in society, you're going to have more likely among LGBT populations to have high levels of depression, lower levels of self-efficacy, and therefore higher levels of sexual risk-taking. So there's like at a nation state level, there's an understanding you need to do something about homophobia, not simply because of human rights, but because of the pragmatic need around health. You also find significant funds out of that $360 million going towards the training of community clinics, because it's really important that, for example, men who have sex with men and trans women are able to access primary healthcare when they need to. Now, if you think about general African contexts and towns and villages, who are the two most important people in a community? It's the pastor and it's the doctor. And if you've got one of those trained to be MSM competent or trans competent and not to be discriminating against individuals with same-sex desire, then you're going quite some way towards addressing sexuality-based justice on the continent. You also find that with the HIV/AIDS argument that you're directly addressing both individuals who identify as heterosexual and individuals who identify as gay, who are MSM, precisely because both groups are at risk of HIV. So there's a need to actually find those spaces, to find those semi-clandestine spaces, to pump those spaces with information, education, condoms, HIV testing, HIV treatment. So the spatial scale and the way in which those spaces are leveraged is very different. And also you find, therefore, certain socio-spatial relationships are therefore validated. But you also here find other challenges. So, in terms of biological risk, it's understood that men who have sex with men and trans women are at higher risk than other groups such as lesbians. That means that all the money and all the resources go towards men who have sex with men and trans women, and no money goes towards lesbians in terms of their HIV risk, which is really problematic because although biologically lesbians are at reduced risk of HIV compared to groups like men who have sex with men, socially, lesbians are at very significant risk of HIV because of terms such as corrective rape, which is an anathema. It's not a correction, it's a punishment. Punishment rape by heterosexual men against lesbians in African contexts is very severe. And those types of issues are not taken into account in HIV programming. You also find that in African contexts, lesbians and gay men, because of the very severe stigma and discrimination that both groups face, want to band together and want to do group activities together. And yet all the funding for activities and resources in these semi-clandestine spaces only goes towards the men, or the trans women. So you get this bifurcation. And so you get the risk here in a different way, but with similar consequences of a potential breaking down of certain social spatial relationships in the context of HIV work. So that's the HIV concern. Oh, and the other concern, obviously, here in terms of legitimacy is that you can re-pathologize sexuality, that you end up linking same-sex sexuality with illness. And this is just some pictures to highlight. So this is work that I used to do. And so for a few years, I left academia and actually worked for USAID. And these are pictures from a secondary city in Uganda at the height of the Museveni attack against gay rights. So this is at the time when internationally Uganda was shouting very loudly and saying, we want to kill gay people. At that time, I was working with the American government, and we were invited into the country by the Department of Health to do HIV work with MSM and trans women to address stigma and discrimination with those groups in the country. So you find on the one hand, Uganda, in terms of human rights and gay rights, being massively opposed to certain forms of legitimacy. But you find on the other hand, the Ugandan government being massively supportive of other types of legitimacy. So this is just an example of how you can have these different international approaches and they may be functioning in different registers. And you can actually end up going into what is the most homophobic country in the continent and actually supporting the needs of those that are ostensibly the most discriminated in the country. The last logic I want to talk about here is economic development, and this is a more recent one. It's being driven by a large group of international, well, multinational companies, some of which are listed here. And they came together in 2015 under the Clinton Foundation with the direct support of former President Bill Clinton to form this coalition called Open for Business. Now, the legitimacy here comes from the desire to enable legal change to support LGBT rights, to facilitate cities in the global south, particularly in Africa, to compete globally. And this draws very much on Richard Florida's work, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, on the creative class. The argument that if you have a wider talent pool of individuals within cities, that includes LGBT populations, you're more likely to be able to compete globally than if you have a smaller talent pool. The way that the Open for Business Coalition works is that it goes around the world and it ranks lots of different cities as to whether they are quote unquote open for business in terms of LGBT acceptance or not, so that LGBT groups can form part of the creative class. So far, 121 cities across the globe have been ranked to see whether they are open for business or not. No cities in sub-Saharan Africa are, with the highest ranked city in the region being my hometown, Cape Town, which scores B, which means low medium risk. Nairobi, meanwhile, scores D, which means high risk, while Dar es Salaam in Tanzania is E, which simply means closed. So the reason for this ranking, as Richard Branson, chairman of the Virgin Group, also part of the Open for Business Coalition, says, is to take the lead, put pressure on governments to change some of the ghastly laws that still exist. The power of a collective business voice is extraordinarily strong. So this is a different form of legitimacy. It's not about human rights. It's about making money. It's about global capital. It's about getting cities in the global south to be able to compete with global cities in the global north. It does, however, run into very particular challenges when it comes to spatial inequalities and potentially breaking down socio-spatial relationships. In terms of spatial inequalities, for anyone that knows anything about urbanization in Africa, the vast majority of urban settlements in many cities in Africa are informal. They're not part of the formal city. If they're informal, it means that they are without state protection, state recognition. They exist without running water, without refuge collection. They're not the types of areas where PwC, the Virgin Group, Deutsche Bank, Microsoft are going to want to be locating themselves in. So in effect, this approach only focuses on a very small, a very narrow proportion of individuals within cities in Africa who can actually exist within the formal sector, which is a significant challenge. We also know from some recent research that there may well be an overrepresentation of non-heteronormative groups within the informal sector. The reason being that we know that there's very severe homophobic stigma in schools across the region. And we know that homophobic stigma can lead to students dropping out of school earlier than they otherwise would, which means they don't complete their studies, which means that they don't get qualifications, which severely limits their ability to access the formal sector. So the suspicion is that within the informal sector, there are far more individuals who are non-heteronormative compared to heterosexual individuals. Although obviously there are many reasons why there are barriers for access to the formal sector. So in conclusion, what does this mean? Well, I would suggest that if we look at human rights approaches around gay rights, we can definitely see the reasons why and the logics why this particular approach has been so widely adopted by international organizations and by organizations in the African continent, various NGOs. But we also need to appreciate that since Hillary Clinton made that statement in 2011, the situation hasn't really got better. And in some cases, like in Uganda, it's got significantly worse. I would suggest that this means that we shouldn't just be critical to be critical for criticism's sake, but we should explore why exactly there have been challenges at being able to engage around this particular discourse to get traction. And the three ways I suggested that is to look at questions of legitimacy, questions of spatial inequality, and questions of socio-spatial relationships. Then using that schema, you can then look at other internationally derived approaches, and you can almost like on a bingo card or something mark off where one approach has been more successful than another in certain areas, and think where exactly a human rights approach might be supported by a health approach, or where exactly a health approach might be supported by an economic development approach, or where exactly none of them might work and some other strategies may be needed. So you could just kind of track across and see where exactly human rights and gay rights articulations fit into a wider schema of international approaches. But I would also suggest that in actuality, the way to do this and the way to think through how exactly these international approaches are functioning in Africa today is to look at the urban scale. And there are various reasons for this. First, in terms of human rights, when you talk about Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, it's not them that's doing the work in Africa. It's local NGOs who get funding from them. And those NGOs are primarily based in primary and secondary cities on the continent. And not only are those NGOs working to affect state law, they're also working to affect municipal law. And so thinking through how exactly local NGOs based in Kampala, based in Nairobi, based in Lusaka, based in Dar es Salaam are actually functioning to work within their own nation state context and their own municipal context is one way of thinking through how these international processes are actually impacting on particular communities. If you think about HIV/AIDS, we know that HIV prevalence is highest in cities. We also know that LGBT populations migrate to cities because of the possibility of wider social sexual networks. Because of that, you could argue that the attention should be paid to where exactly PEPFAR, USAID, these different organizations are doing their work, and that is in cities. And so again, the city becomes a key mechanism through which to understand how this international set of processes, driven overwhelmingly by the United States government, is impacting on local communities in the global south. And obviously, a focus on economic development, well, the Open for Business Coalition is only focused on cities. And we might want to think there a bit more critically about a more holistic understanding of what these cities are by including the informal sector. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.